Owimboe, 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 owimboe. Eeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeee Dark Materials by Philip Pullman, one of the most iconic fantasy series of recent years. Certainly one of the best-selling. It's been adapted into a movie and is currently in works to be adapted again over at the BBC. I think I've read them twice before and kind of reaffirming some opinions I had, clearing some misconceptions I had about the series, because my opinion certainly has been tainted by some of the online rhetoric that does exist toward these books. People saying that after book one, the series is completely worthless and terrible. I think there's definitely a downturn after book one, but there's still a very good story being told there. Certainly not worth overwhelming hate or just complete dismissal as the internet seems to insist. But the standout Golden Compass is definitely the best of the trilogy. There's not really much disputing that. It has the best world building, character development, concise, well-packed narrative plot, pacing, just really everything there works to a much better degree than a bit of the confusion and overall chaos that does infest the next two books. It becomes much less focused, and I think that is really where the critical failure of the trilogy lies. But that failure is not great enough to, once again, dismiss the entire trilogy. What I want to focus on right now, though, is the usage of one of my favorite fantasy tropes. Tropes are not always a bad thing. Wait for a World Hoppers video on that. But this trope I really enjoy, and that's the side companion that acts as kind of a personal conduit and discussion into the character's mind, and in this it takes place in Lyra's demon. This very intimate relationship exists where you get to see her innermost honest thoughts expressed, and there's a bit of a back and forth. They have real great relationship and character dynamic between them. It feels real, and it makes the reader feel so much more connected to what's happening in this girl's life because she has this intimate relationship at the core of it. The love between the two is so much better done than what a lot of fantasy authors are able to or consistently put out at all, and that is really where I think his Dark Materials shines the strongest. The relationship between Lyra and her demon, and a couple other characters as well. And the other place where this series really stands out is definitely the world building. The world building of this series is incredibly strong in my opinion, and that again is of course the most true for the first book. We are introduced to some unique elements with the fantasy genre I've not even seen copied well at all since Philip Pullman first put it on the page, such as having these sentient armored polar bears battle. That's really cool. We've seen many things similar to demons since Philip Pullman put them on the page, and there were clear things that came beforehand that were direct inspirations, but I think he, again, has the best execution of this kind of intimate side companion I've read in fantasy, rivaled closely, possibly, by Brandon Sanderson and Stormlight. No spoilers for that series, but I'll let that series age and get a couple more entries in before I make any definitive statements. But having this side character that is directly linked to a main protagonist that lets you peer into their mind in such a nuanced way is so well done here, and I give Philip Pullman all of the credit for that. So yes, for me, the strongest things were Lyra's character itself, the world building, and one particular relationship. Now, it's also worth noting that the magic system within his Dark Materials is fairly not standard. It's a mixture of soft and hard, depending on which magic system you're referring to. There are creatures and dark things, which to me, while not entirely original or new creations, are certainly neat enough and twisted enough from their inspirations to stand out very well. And what's impressive is how well all these different elements are blended, having multiple magic systems, having humankind and our machines directly cut and affect this magic system is done, again, to great effect. If you notice, this is a fairly positive review, and that's because I do disagree with quite a bit of the heated, heavy criticism that's lopped on this series right now. We'll get into that more in a minute, but again, I just want to talk about the blending of all these elements in this world stands out to me significantly, because a lot of it feels like it shouldn't quite fit, especially dimensional hopping, which occurs later on in the series, worked better than most. It's a difficult thing to pull off. I don't think it was flawless, by any means, but it worked well, and I actually think that's due to the lens of there being child characters, which are better at being the introduction to worlds, because while they're taking this curious, odd lens that the reader sits in, it makes more sense than an adult who might just be more freaked out or less curious than a child in this situation would be. Because I've mentioned child characters, I'm waiting for my frequent viewers who are going to respond with, "Daniel, you hate child characters! How can you possibly like Lyra and what's going on?" And that's because Philip Pullman does what I like best with child characters and really pushes back against what makes me dislike them, and that's that he treats them with respect. Very often, regardless of genre, if there's a child character, they are handled like an idiot, like they are not their own sentient being, and they just become a vassal to accept exposition dumps, or just ask very obvious questions the reader needs answered, or several other things, yada yada yada, that authors use them as cheap devices for. And while that's done in this series occasionally, it's subverted or hidden well enough that it's not glaring, and I do think there's enough character put into these, essentially children, that they still stand out as individuals. For some reason, people make the accusation that this series is young adult. I really don't agree with that. There was a brief time where it was marketed as such, and that was around the time of the original movie release, which I think was just a bad choice someone high up made, because not only is there dark and disturbing scenes in this story that, if they were portrayed differently or actually portrayed that many of them were actually dropped for that movie, would certainly, in my opinion, disqualify this for being read to a child or young adult who is not ready. There's a lot of child abuse, an excessive amount of pretty severe, messed up child abuse. And now let's shift to a few of the criticisms I actually do agree with in his Dark Materials. The message from the author is very heavy-handed. There's not a lot of tact here on how Philip Pullman feels about religion and governments and things like that. It's not quite as bad as A Good Kind, but it's approaching, and he's adding a couple layers of disconnect, but there is definitely some preaching from the author that stands out rather strong. And while I agree and disagree with some of it, it's a bit of a mixed bag, and it's so blatant that if you just do not like authors preaching to you, it could certainly ruin this whole series. Subtlety did not exactly exist in The Subtle Knife. And yes, as the second and third book were introduced into the overall story, it became a little muddled, and the focused, tight narrative and sharp character dynamics that really drove the first book became much more dull, and the world somehow felt smaller while being so much bigger. The first book established this grandiose system, and there was so much exploring of ideas that exist within this world and make sense that you at times didn't even care about the very blunt messaging because it was just so wondrous. The second and third book lose quite a bit of that wonder, and the messaging and speeches become much more direct. "Here is my opinion," kind of becomes the overall tone of the story. Once again, it's not to the utter and complete detriment of the series. I think it's a very valid option to just pick up the Golden Compass, read that, and then put it down. It's kind of a story that you could just view that as, oh, we're going to have an open ending and move on. And I honestly wish it had ended there, kind of. And this is with me thinking the next two books are not horrible, but it could have just been done. We could have had this just wonderful one-off, change the ending maybe a little bit, and it might even be hailed up as one of the greats. But as is fair in criticism, if a couple more entries into the series are really rough, it can become difficult to ignore them. Think of it as dropping down from a possible 9 out of 10 to a solid 6, light 7 kind of territory. It's a sharp enough turn down that if your series ends on that note, it's gonna foul the taste of the overall experience. While it was kicked off wonderfully, it just slowly descends into, don't, please, kind of, change it. No, we're done. I think anyone who is most dependent on characters, being attached to those characters, and really getting hooked into a awesome magic system and well-built world could still really enjoy this, but if a lack of a more concise, tightly knit, well-focused plot is going to bother you, a sudden kind of shrinking of expectations, and arguably some just straight up bad narrative choices from an author can really wreck a whole series for you, I understand why you might kind of hold a hesitance to pick up his Dark Materials in general, and if you've already read it, have a rather negative opinion of the series. I think Golden Compass, the first book, is just so well done. It makes me kind of really like the next two just because there's such fondness that exists there. Let me know what you think of the His Dark Materials series in the comments down below. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Is the first book just definitely the standout like I'm saying and the next two are not worth picking up? Or do you find it all the way through? I think it starts at a solid 9 and descends to the lowest point at possibly a 6, but it's still not horrid and sits well above the average of the genre in general. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this series review, and I look forward to seeing your comments and the very civil discussion that will continue on. Like and subscribe if you're not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here, and have a good one, y'all. Peace!